Support the show by donating at themusicbuds.com. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Music Buds podcast. This is episode number 19, and my name is Henry. This week, I am so honored to be joined by the composer Ben Lovett, who just worked on the new comedy horror film, The Wolf of Snow Hollow, as well as a number of other acclaimed works, including Synchronicity, Netflix's The Ritual, The Wind, I Trapped the Devil. I mean, so many great films. Ben, I can't tell you how much it means for you to be taking the time. I love it and respect your work very much, and so I really appreciate you doing this.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, first of all, how's life these days?
In progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting as always.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you about, I'm always curious as to how composers get started, because I feel like there are so many different avenues to which that can happen. Was composing something you always wanted to do, or?
No. I had a very sort of strange route into it. In a lot of ways, a lot of like the different sort of progression of my career has been sort of backwards in a way. And in that, I didn't grow up learning to play music or studying music, or I didn't have a music teacher or was never really involved in it. I was just somebody that enjoyed listening to music like anyone else. Yeah. And creating it or making it was never really something that seemed like, I guess I just never really thought about it because it never seemed like it was an option that was available to me. I grew up in rural Georgia, and I didn't really know anyone that played an instrument. And then I was a teenager and discovered punk rock, and discovered kind of the whole concept of like, well, it doesn't really matter if you know how to play or not. Sure. You just do it anyway. Yeah. As long as you have something to say and you have some conviction about what you're doing, you just sort of make your own way and figure it out on your own. And that kind of general, damn it all, DIY ethic was sort of like a foundational piece of just going like, oh, okay, I get it. You just got to get a guitar and plug it in and figure out what you want to say. And so I had fell into that late in high school, and then wound up going to college at the University of Georgia. I met a bunch of kids who were sort of banding together to create this movie. This is in like the mid to late 90s. And, someone had suggested to them that I do the music, which I thought was a terrible idea. And I tried to convince them that was, absurd, because I didn't even know anything about where I would even begin to score a movie. And they kind of said, well, we don't know anything about making a movie, so why should that? Yeah. And so, from there, that sort of like, that was how I got into it, was just realizing that I had no real good reason not to, other than being afraid of what you don't know, which is really the last thing you should be afraid of, know? And so you do one, and then one leads to two, and two leads to four, and four leads to, and before you know it, you turn around and for the past 20 years, you've been doing movies. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that works, because I think some of the most interesting composers working right now are non-traditional ones. They bring in something that you would not expect at all, but in the best way. It's like you haven't heard that style of sound. And so I think that avenue seems to be the right way to go these days. Well, for me, it's sort of like, I think of it all as I'm a storyteller. Like, I'm a collaborating storyteller who comes on board a project and helps the director or the team, effectively tell this story. I just happen to specialize in the sound and musical element of that storytelling. So I think about it more as just being someone that collaborates in that aspect of it, more so than it necessarily always having to be about writing a piece of music, as much as sort of everything involved in how you affect an audience through sound and music. Yeah. Being the area that I'm kind of helping come in and communicate to. And I don't think you necessarily need a musical background in order to do that any more than you need to know how the camera works in order to direct a scene. If you kind of know what you're trying to get to in terms of the emotion you're trying to create or how you're trying to contribute to the story, then there's a lot of different ways to sort of go about doing that. And I only say that because I just feel like you should never let what you don't know be a reason to not even give it a try.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one thing that I had read that you had mentioned is that, well, I mean, because when I first saw your work, I said, oh, it's like this guy has done a lot of like horror, like kind of like heavy drama, and I saw that you had mentioned you tend to cling to that because those life and death situations offer the most emotional kind of openings for music. Is that still true?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I don't have a particular interest in any one genre of film or story or art or music or anything any more than any other. I just like good stories, or I just like good songs, like good movies. I don't know that I'm drawn to working on any particular kind of music or film any more than any other, but I do tend to find that the genre stuff and the more intense films are the one area where you're going to kind of deal with the whole range of human emotion in 90 minutes. Mm-hmm. In a good horror film, like you gotta, there's going to be things that are, scary, maybe a little funny, usually pretty hair raising, intense. You're going to have some really heartfelt and sad moments. You kind of have to be able to round the bases, and trying to come up with like a palette of sounds and, a general motif or thesis of what the music is doing, and do it in a way that can hit all those bases and can land in all those places is always a really interesting challenge. It's not to say that I don't enjoy, like, I did a documentary that came out earlier this year that is 180-degree opposite sort of thing than something like The Ritual or even a sci-fi thing like Synchronicity. But it's just that the variety kind of keeps it interesting. Yeah. But the genre stuff kind of lets you get pretty experimental, and there's a really wide bandwidth of techniques and styles and things that can come into play when you're doing the spooky stuff. Yeah. I do want to get to Snow Hollow, but I think of all your great work, I think my favorite is The Wind, which is this really like dark, like chilling Western. And one connection that I thought was so interesting that I have is me being in North Carolina, is you got some instruments from the mountains of North Carolina. Yeah. That score was recorded. Wait, where are you in North Carolina? I'm in the Raleigh-Durham area, so like central North Carolina. Yeah, so I recorded that score in Asheville. Oh yeah, I'm about 3 hours from there. Yeah, and I did Wolf of Snow Hollow in Asheville as well. Oh, cool. And so most of The Wind was recorded in Asheville. There were the two primary instruments in that score are the bass flute, and the bass flute player is in Los Angeles, but everything else, all the strings and the nickel harpa and all these other kind of folk instruments that I used on that score, all that stuff was done in the church at Echo Mountain in Asheville, which is a studio there. And it was a bit about trying to find, kind of a primitive set of sounds and instrumentation that could sort of speak to the aesthetic of that kind of nebulous 1700s, 1800s. You can't quite tell exactly where it falls. Right. Open prairie kind of sound. And that's a good example of like, a film like that gives you a really interesting aesthetic palette visually that you can draw a lot from. And that's kind of what I did with that. I mean, it's called The Wind. So it was kind of like, maybe let's use wind instruments, I mean, like you get like anywhere you can draw some idea, just touching it back to your question about starting points, anything that can help define some kind of a direction, or, you want to set your own productive, creative limitations, because the most anxiety-inducing part of every project is the very beginning, when there's just, you can go in any given direction. You got to figure out which one you're going to go in and what you're going to use and kind of commit to for the score.
Yeah, that really comes through because that Western world has such like space, for lack of a better word, and so the score has that kind of breathy like hollowness in a good way, like you know, and so it works.
A lot of that is her. I realized, you know, when we were doing some recording experiments, that just her sort of breathing and blowing through this instrument, this long, you know, like it's like 5-6 foot long bass flute, it just created a certain sort of texture and sound. And, you know, sometimes a lot of what I do is the quality of the sound and the tonality of it is as important to me in what it might be doing melodically or musically.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's just as simple as like, hey, you just kind of breathing through that thing is rad. So why force a bunch of notes onto that when it's producing the effect that we need right here, you know?
Yeah. And one thing with that, in terms of the music that you've done, is it like doing such like a dark film like that? Is it kind of emotionally draining to do something like that? That is so, I mean, listening to it again in a great way, it takes a lot out of you. And watching that movie, it's so intense. Is actually the process of making the music, like, is it satisfying in that way, or is it also kind of taxing in a way to do that kind of heavy material?
It's a good question. I think it's probably a lot harder on the spouses and people who have to live with us crazy people during these stretches when we're working on this, because you spend all day in a like pretty dark, fucked up place, you know? And so it's like, there's, you know, only so many hours a day you can sort of sit with your mission being to create some of the most unsettling sounds and tones. But I think that the answer is essentially yes and no. Like, it's yes in that it can be, you know, it's kind of difficult just when you have like a nice, pretty day outside the window and you're, you know, 6 hours deep in just like this shit all day, you know, and it's like, but when you have such a fascination for sound in general and just the exploratory nature of trying to kind of create these colors and these combinations of sounds that kind of produce a feeling, when you get it, even if it's horrible, you're just like, oh,
yeah, right.
Like, it's so cool. You get off so much on just creating and painting that even when the painting is quite dark, you just sort of enjoy the craft of doing that so much that, you know, you live through it, but there's only so many hours a day and days a week and weeks a month, you know, that it accumulates over time that by the time you're done with it, you kind of want to pivot and do like a romantic comedy or something like that, just to sort of cleanse a spiritual palate.
Mm-hmm. Shifting to The Wolf of Snow Hollow, which is, God, that's such a cool movie. And it's like, and one thing that struck me immediately is it has such a finessed, particular tone and style. Like, it walks this very fine line between comedy and drama, comedy and horror, and it could be so easy in another case for that to go completely off the rails and to be a mess, but it never does. It stays really true to that. Was doing music for a film that has such a, I guess, a delicate feeling to it. Was that exciting, or was that kind of nerve-wracking, having to kind of be so malleable?
Well, that's a good question, because it was both. And I credit everything that you're describing about its ability to do that well to Jim Cummings, who's the writer, director, and star of this movie. And if anyone's seen Snow Hollow, they obviously know what you're referring to. And if anyone has seen Jim's first film, Thunder Road, they know that's kind of what Jim does. And Thunder Road is as much a comedy and drama. Simultaneously, things are funny and totally just heartbreaking. You know, everything that's sweet is bittersweet, and everything that is horrible is also sort of funny in its horribleness. And he has just a really unique way of doing that and balancing those things. And so it was seeing Thunder Road that made me jump at the opportunity to work on Snow Hollow. But there was very little music in Thunder Road. There's like 2 or 3 music cues in the whole movie, and they're really short and they're very minimal. And so I didn't really know, and I think nor did Jim, what the music's role needed to be in sort of helping reinforce that. And so I think in the early part of the process, I might have been doing things that leaned a little too much into the comedy. And he would have to kind of say like, no, you need to lean the other way. Don't wink, or don't let the music nod too much or acknowledge too much the humor. Play it straight, and the humor works only when it's sort of, you're not looking directly at it.
Right.
And so, but the music had to have some sense of awareness that it was in a comedy, ostensibly, right? And so it took a while to sort of figure out, when I kind of came around to this idea of like, well, what if we do this kind of like Bernard Herrmann inspired kind of throwback thing that sort of has like that bigness, and it can speak to and service the action stuff and the horror scenes and all, and it can honor the moment of the guy walking out onto the patio and finding his girlfriend chopped to pieces and the horror of that. But it speaks to that in a way that, services the cinema of it, but it also kind of acknowledges the comedy and the sort of absurdity of it.
Right. And
for some reason, that old school 50s Hollywood mystery thriller kind of sound and feel kind of does that,
Yeah.
It has this bigness about it that's so big or so ambitious that, but it's a fine line, because you can really easily get into ring. I mean, you're real close to just doing that.
Yeah.
Like a lot of what I'm doing is teetering right on the line of that. And that is immediately just laughable, right?
Yeah.
That's just going to seem like it's slapstick. So trying to like get right up against that, but not tip the thing over, was sort of a unique challenge.
Yeah. I think that could be so. I mean, as you had discussed, like starting that project like that, it could be daunting, but also I feel like as an artist, that's still so so motivating to have that like open canvas of possibilities. So that's cool.
Yeah, and I'm always looking for a new challenge, and like you said, like having done a fair share of genre films and films that one would consider horror. Like there's a lot of people that I don't know that they would consider this a horror film. There's a lot of people that would call it a comedy. Some people would call it, I've heard it called a tragicomedy. I've heard it called just straight horror, which you certainly can.
Yeah.
But it's just a movie. It's just a fun movie that kind of has a little bit of all that stuff. And so I knew that it was going to need something that would end up being uniquely different than what I had done, on previous projects.
Yeah. Well, jumping back a little bit to I Trapped the Devil, which is this like Christmas horror film, and like it has that great kind of influences that you were touching on. It has that like classic Hollywood or mid 70s 60s horror feel of this, like it's kind of Christmassy, but it's also really scary and weird and experimental. Was that a fun project to work on?
It was. My initial thing when I came on board that was like Josh Lobo, the writer and director, had reached out, and he had cast Scott Poitras and AJ Bowen, who I've known for decades, and we all met in college on that very first movie that I mentioned way back, and they were in The Signal, and I did, we were all like part of that family that made The Signal in Sundance 2007. And so, when he told me they were in it, I was like, all right, well, if they're in it, he was like, I don't really have much money, but like you can kind of do whatever you want. And so I said, all right, well, I'm going to try to make sleigh bells scary. I remember it was my first idea, was like, it's a Christmas horror movie. Let's see if we can make easily the most non-scary sounding Christmas thing scary.
Right.
And a little bit of that did wind up in there. You can sort of hear some like these like little single slow kind of hits of these sleigh bells that, but originally I was like, it's going to be all sleigh bells. That didn't quite happen. But
maybe one day.
yeah, I know. And but I don't know. What I really liked the most about that film when I was going into it was I was like, okay, so this is kind of like a stage play. Like this is like 3 characters in one location.
Yeah.
That like you could do this as a stage play, and it felt like that to me. And there was something about the like containment of it, and the limitations of just going like, all right, so this is like a shoestring budget with 3 characters in a house. It's all about mood and atmosphere. And like, you got to really lean into the stakes so that every little nuanced thing matters. And I thought, Josh has a style. Like there was something he was doing with it that felt, there was like a pulpy, like tactile feel to the, like even what's on screen.
Yeah.
Just the way it's shot and the way it breathes and feels, and I said, all right, so basically we need to like, I think we had a conversation at one point where he was like, basically evil. He goes, just imagine this like, it's like a gas leak in the house or something. It's like evil is just slowly poisoning the air in the house.
Right.
It's just, they're just slowly being subjected to this thing that they don't even sort of realize. And I said, okay, I like that idea. Let me get into that and see, what we can do with that. And again, it was a different sort of set of circumstances and a different like palette to kind of deal with. But it did feel like, again, like very different than Snow Hollow, but similar in that it felt like it was channeling some inspiration from genre films from way back, not necessarily like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but like 30 or 40 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Now, having worked with a lot of different directors and a lot of different styles, are you someone who watches movies a lot, or are you someone who listens to music all that much?
I certainly got into doing this because of both. But I would say that one of the worst like symptoms of being somewhat successful at this is that the more time you spend working on movies and making albums, the less time you seem to have or spend just consuming them.
Right.
And I don't like, that's something that I take responsibility for, because I've realized that you have to start to really prioritize and make time to do that. Because when you spend every waking hour, all you end up hearing is your own shit,
Yeah.
It's kind of like you really lose perspective on things, and you really kind of maybe start to forget, just because you spend, or I do, I'm sure a lot of people do, you spend so much time not liking what you're listening to because you're trying to make stuff, and you got to go through cycles and cycles of stuff that you're just like, this sucks, to find something that you really get into and like. And that's such a process that when you just listen to stuff, you remember like, oh, right, I do this because of how much I enjoy being a listener or just watching movies. And so I've tried to get better about prioritizing and making time to just sit and go and enjoy this thing. Because so much of it's such a struggle and it's such a battle. And like this work can really rattle your sort of self-confidence and your sense of worth, value, and all of this that you're putting into that you sometimes the best way to reconnect to that is, or to combat that is to reconnect with a foundational love of just listening to music.
Yeah. One thing, veering away from movies a little bit, is I wanted to ask you about this collaboration with Matt Skiba from Blink-182, because I love that band, and I was so excited to see that you had collaborated with him, not with Blink-182, but on Heavens. How did that collaboration come about?
Heavens was just a studio side project that we did, Skiba and myself and Josiah Steinbrück. This was in 2006, I think. I was living in LA, had a studio out there, and this was pre Blink-182 for Skiba. This is when he was still just fronting the Alkaline trio.
Okay.
And he was really looking for an outlet. I think they were off in between record cycles, and he had some time, and he had moved to LA from Chicago. And, we had known each other from years prior from just touring and being in punk rock bands and running around the country, raising hell. And we reconnected out there, and he and Joe had written these songs, literally just in the bedroom on a 4-track cassette player. And it just kind of happened organically. I mean, they were looking for someone to produce a record who didn't make traditional rock records in studios. They were trying to get away from that. And those two guys had very, very different influences and backgrounds, but they had sort of a common love for some of the influences that one can sort of immediately pick up on in that project. And so we all kind of did it as a bit of a just fun love letter studio project over a summer. But then the record turned out pretty good. Yeah. And Epitaph signed it and put it out and said, we really want to get you guys on the road. So then we needed to sort of reverse engineer a band out of that. And so we put a band together from people immediately who were around and had played on the record. Cornbread Compton, who is the drummer now in Electric Guest. And, he's composed the scores to MacGruber and Palm Springs, the Sandberg movie that was just.
Yeah.
So Cornbread was around at the time. So he played drums, and Joe and his wife Erica and Skiba and I all went out and toured this thing around the UK and the US and Canada. And it was a fucking blast because he had this huge fan base already in place who this project just sort of fell right into the hands of. And so I think the first show we ever played as a band was a sold out club in Manchester, England. And all these kids already knew all the words to the songs. We had never played a show. It was the first show
That's awesome.
for this band. It was amazing. Yeah. So it was a blast.
That's awesome. Well, Ben, I love talking to you. Is there anything else? I mean, there are so many projects we could touch on. Is there any others that come to mind, or is there anything else about your work you want to mention? I don't want to leave anything hanging.
If I can do it, you can too.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're listening to this because you're interested in doing this and haven't, just do it. Just go find somebody, or just make something, or just rip something off the internet and put your music on it and put it up there. It's like, if I've managed to have a career in this and I just stumbled into it face first with just a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of, willingness to work my ass off for it, then if you're somebody listening to this because you're interested in doing this, but you don't know if there's some prerequisite or some special thing you need to know or understand, you don't, you learn by doing it.
Yeah.
So just do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Ben, again, I thank you so much for taking the time, and you're welcome back whenever you would like. And
thanks, man.
Yeah. And once again, I really love listening to your work, and both out of the films as well as in them. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, man.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, everybody. Well, we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we'll see you next time.